78% of the air you are breathing right now is nitrogen. Every single breath, every moment of every day, you are surrounded and completely submerged in the most essential nutrient your plants will ever need. And yet, right now, somewhere in your garden, your vegetables are starving for it. Your soil is begging for it. And you are spending money, real money, buying it back in a plastic bag from a corporation that charges you $150, $200, sometimes $300 a year just to give your plants what the sky is already offering for free. That is not bad luck. That is not nature's design. That is a system, a very deliberate, very profitable system, that has kept you from knowing one simple truth for the last 80 years. There is a bacteria. It has no brand name. It does not come in a glossy bottle. It costs roughly $2 to cultivate at home, fits inside a mason jar on your kitchen counter, and it does something that sounds almost impossible the first time you hear it. It pulls nitrogen directly out of thin air and converts it into plant-available fertilizer, inside your soil, around the clock, completely for free. It is called azotobacter. Scientists have known about it since 1901. Entire governments once built their agricultural programs around it. And then, almost overnight, it disappeared from Western farming knowledge right at the exact same moment the synthetic fertilizer industry exploded into a $200 billion empire. Coincidence? You are about to decide that for yourself, because once you understand what was buried and why, you will never look at a bag of fertilizer the same way again. The year is 1901. In a small laboratory in the Netherlands, a microbiologist named Martinus Beijerinck is peering through a microscope at something that should not exist, at least not according to everything science believed at the time. He has just isolated a free-living soil bacterium that can pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and fix it into the earth without needing any host plant, without any symbiotic relationship, without any help at all. He names it Azotobacter cruococcum, and in a quietly published paper that most of the world completely ignores, he describes what is essentially a living nitrogen factory that exists naturally in healthy soil all over the planet. For the next 3 decades, the discovery sits at the edges of agricultural science. Interesting, acknowledged, but not yet understood in its full power. Then in the 1930s and 1940s, something shifts. Soviet agronomists, working under enormous pressure to feed a massive population with limited industrial resources, begin studying azotobacter with serious intent. By the late 1940s, the USSR has developed what they call azotobacterin, a cultured inoculant that farmers could apply directly to seeds or soil. Field trials across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Siberia report yield increases of 10 to 20% on wheat, corn, and vegetable crops. The Soviet Agricultural Ministry begins distributing it nationally. This is not a folk remedy. This is state-sponsored science, applied at scale across millions of hectares. India follows. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, the ICAR, begins its own azotobacter program. Researchers at institutions in Pune, Delhi, and Bangalore publish study after study confirming what the Soviets had found. This organism, when introduced into healthy aerobic soil, colonizes the root zone, fixes atmospheric nitrogen continuously, and produces additional compounds, auxins, gibberellins, cytokinins, that actively stimulate root development and plant growth. By 1960, biofertilizer programs involving azotobacter are running in multiple Indian states, reaching smallholder farmers who cannot afford chemical inputs. And in Western Europe and North America, during this same period, almost nothing. Because by the early 1950s, the petrochemical industry had already begun its conquest of global agriculture. The Haber-Bosch process, developed to manufacture ammonia for explosives during World War I, had been repurposed into synthetic nitrogen fertilizer production, and the infrastructure investment was enormous, the lobbying was aggressive, and the message delivered to farmers, universities, and governments was simple and seductive. Why rely on invisible microbes in the dirt when you can buy nitrogen in a bag guaranteed every season at a predictable price? The knowledge did not disappear because it was disproven. It disappeared because it was inconvenient. And the people who paid the price for that inconvenience were every gardener, every smallholder, Every home farmer who was never told that the answer to their nitrogen problem was already living in the air above their heads. But here is what the industry never counted on. The science was never actually destroyed. It was just buried. And what was buried can always be dug back up. Stay with me, because what comes next explains exactly why this organism works and why the $200 billion fertilizer industry has every reason in the world to hope you never find out. Let us talk about money, not your money, and although that is coming. Let us talk about their money first, because you cannot fully understand why a century-old scientific discovery stays hidden unless you understand exactly how much profit depends on you never learning about it. The global nitrogen fertilizer market was valued at $201 billion in 2023, $201 billion every single year, built almost entirely on one premise, that your soil cannot feed your plants without their product. That premise is the foundation of an empire. An azotobacter, a microscopic organism that has existed in healthy soil for millions of years, is a direct threat to every dollar of it. Think about what that number actually means at the consumer level. The average serious home gardener in the United States spends between $150 and $300 per year on nitrogen-based fertilizers alone. Urea, ammonium nitrate, blood meal, synthetic NPK blends. The products change, the branding changes, the price point shifts, but the dependency stays exactly the same. You run out, you go back to the store, you hand over your money, and the cycle continues. A functional azotobacter culture, by contrast, costs approximately $2 in materials to produce at home. Molasses, water, a clean jar, and a small amount of healthy garden soil as your starter culture. $2 one time for a colony that, if maintained correctly, reproduces indefinitely. That is not a discount. That is a fundamentally different economic relationship with your own garden. And here is where the $200 billion industry gets nervous, because the threat is not just financial, it is structural. The entire model of industrial agriculture depends on what economists call input dependency. You do not own your fertility, you rent it season after season from companies that have spent decades and hundreds of millions of dollars ensuring that the alternative, biological nitrogen fixation, cover cropping, living soil management, stays complicated, stays academic, stays out of mainstream gardening culture. In 2022 alone, the top 5 synthetic fertilizer corporations, including Yara International, CF Industries, and Nutrien, spent a combined $47 million on lobbying and industry advocacy across the United States and European Union. $47 million to shape policy, influence agricultural education curricula, and ensure that when a farmer or a gardener asks, "How do I feed my plants?" the answer they receive always leads back to a purchase. The $201 billion market does not just sell fertilizer. It sells the belief that biological alternatives are unreliable, unscientific, or simply not powerful enough for modern growing. And that belief has been remarkably successful. Survey data from the National Gardening Association in 2021 found that fewer than 8% of home gardeners in the United States had ever heard of biofertilizer inoculants as a legitimate nitrogen source. Fewer than 8% in a country of 55 million households with gardens. That is not public ignorance. That is the result of a very well-funded, very consistent, decades-long information architecture designed to keep that number as low as possible. Because the moment that number starts climbing, the moment ordinary people realize they can cultivate their own nitrogen source at home for $2 using a technique that Soviet agricultural scientists validated at national scale in the 1940s, and Indian researchers confirmed across millions of smallholder farms in the 1960s, the $201 billion market begins to crack. Not overnight, not completely, but enough to matter, enough to be worth preventing. You are not a customer who made a free choice to buy synthetic fertilizer. You are a customer who was never told there was another option. And that distinction, that specific, deliberate gap in what you were allowed to know, is worth $200 billion a year to the people who created it. Now you know the size of what you are up against. So let us go deeper into the actual science of how this organism works. Because once you understand the mechanism, you will realize that this is not hope or theory. This is biochemistry. This is measurable, reproducible, and it is waiting in your soil right now. Here is where the story stops being about history and politics and becomes something far more powerful. It becomes about biology that you can hold in your hands. Because understanding why Azotobacter works is not just satisfying intellectually. It is the difference between using this method correctly and watching it fail. And the science, once you actually see it, is almost absurdly elegant. Start with the basic problem. Nitrogen makes up 78% of Earth's atmosphere, but atmospheric nitrogen exists as N2. Two nitrogen atoms bonded together with a triple covalent bond, one of the strongest chemical bonds in nature. Plants cannot break that bond. Their roots cannot absorb N2 directly. What they need is fixed nitrogen, nitrogen that has been converted into ammonium, NH4+, or nitrate, NO3, forms that dissolve in soil water and can be taken up through root membranes. The entire synthetic fertilizer industry exists to perform this one conversion chemically at enormous energy cost through the Haber-Bosch process, which requires temperatures of 400 to 500 degrees Celsius and pressures of 150 to 300 atmospheres. It consumes approximately 1 to 2% of the entire world's annual energy supply just to crack that nitrogen bond. Azotobacter does the same thing at room temperature, in your soil, using zero external energy, powered entirely by organic carbon it scavenges from the ground around it. The mechanism is an enzyme called nitrogenase. It is one of the most ancient and biochemically sophisticated proteins ever discovered. Researchers at the University of California, Riverside published a study in 2018 estimating that nitrogenase evolved approximately 1.5 billion years ago, long before complex plant life existed on Earth. Nitrogenase captures N2 molecules from air pockets in the soil, breaks the triple bond using electrons and a small molecule called ATP as energy currency, and outputs ammonium directly into the surrounding soil matrix. The reaction requires the enzyme to be protected from oxygen, which would destroy it, and Azotobacter has evolved a remarkable solution to this problem. It maintains one of the highest cellular respiration rates of any known organism, essentially burning oxygen so fast in its outer membrane that the interior of the cell stays anaerobic even while living in fully aerobic soil. It creates its own oxygen-free chamber inside itself. No other free-living, nitrogen-fixing bacterium does this as effectively, which is precisely why Azotobacter is uniquely suited to garden soil rather than waterlogged or anaerobic environments where other nitrogen fixers like Clostridium require. Now the numbers. A 2019 study published by the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, drawing on field trials across 6 states and over 3,400 individual plots, found that soil inoculated with viable Azotobacter cultures fixed between 20 and 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year under moderate organic matter conditions. For context, a typical vegetable garden requires roughly 100 to 150 kg of nitrogen per hectare annually for strong production. That means a well-established Azotobacter population can supply 20 to 40% of your total nitrogen requirement from nothing but air and soil carbon. No purchase, no delivery, no bag. The same study documented average yield increases of 10 to 30% across tomato, eggplant, spinach, and legume crops when Azotobacter inoculant was applied alongside a 50% reduction in synthetic fertilizer. Not in addition to full chemical inputs, in replacement of half of them with better results. But nitrogen fixation is only part of what makes this organism extraordinary. Azotobacter is also a prolific producer of plant growth hormones. As it colonizes the rhizosphere, the thin zone of soil directly surrounding plant roots, it secretes indole-3-acetic acid, a natural auxin that stimulates root cell elongation and dramatically increases the surface area of the root system. More root surface means more water absorption, more mineral uptake, and greater structural stability in the plant. It also produces gibberellins, which accelerate germination and early stem growth, and cytokinins, which regulate cell division and delay leaf senescence, meaning your plants stay productive and green longer into the season. A 2020 paper in the journal Applied Soil Ecology found that azotobacter inoculation increased root biomass in tomato seedlings by an average of 34% compared to uninoculated controls within just 21 days of application. There is one more mechanism worth understanding, and this one surprises most people when they first hear it. Azotobacter produces significant quantities of extracellular polysaccharides, complex sugar molecules that it secretes into the surrounding soil. These polysaccharides act as a biological glue, binding soil particles together into aggregates. Better soil aggregation means improved pore structure, which means better water retention, better gas exchange, and a more hospitable environment for the entire soil food web. Earthworms, beneficial fungi, other bacteria. One organism, applied once, begins restructuring your soil's physical architecture from the inside out. This is not a supplement. This is not a Band-Aid. This is a foundational shift in how your soil functions, and it costs $2 to start. Now, here is what you need to know before we go further, because honesty matters more than hype. Azotobacter is not a miracle replacement for all fertilization in severely degraded or heavily compacted soil. If your soil has a pH below 6.0, very low organic matter, or has been sterilized by repeated heavy chemical applications, azotobacter populations will struggle to establish. The organism needs a minimum level of soil health to thrive. It amplifies a good system. It cannot resurrect a dead one overnight. We will address exactly how to prepare your soil in the next section. But in a garden with even moderate organic matter in a pH between 6.0 and 8.5, what you are about to learn is not just possible. According to 80 years of suppressed agricultural research, it is almost inevitable. Here is the moment where everything shifts. Not just the science, not just the history, but the way you see yourself in relation to your own garden, your own food, your own land. For most of your life, if you grew up in the modern Western gardening tradition, you were handed a specific identity without ever being asked if you wanted it. You are a consumer of fertility, someone who buys growth in a bag, who measures success by what the label promises, who returns to the store every spring because the system told you, quietly, persistently, through every gardening magazine and home improvement aisle and YouTube advertisement, that healthy plants begin with a purchase. That identity was not an accident. It was engineered, refined over 7 decades, and it was worth, as you now know, $201 billion a year to the people who built it. But here's the truth that changes everything. You were never actually dependent. You were made to feel dependent. And those are not the same thing. The farmers of ancient China, of pre-colonial India, of indigenous North America, they did not have a fertilizer aisle. They had observation, patience, and an intimate understanding of the living systems beneath their feet. They composted, they rotated, they inoculated their soils with aged earth from productive plots and passed that knowledge down across generations. They were not primitive. They were operating with a sophistication that modern industrial agriculture spent a century trying to make you forget. Because a farmer who understands their soil's biology is a farmer who does not need to buy very much at all. You are not a customer. You are a cultivator. And that distinction, once you feel it, really feel it, changes how you walk through your garden. Now, before we move into exactly how to build your azotobacter culture at home, there is one thing that needs to be said clearly, because credibility matters more than inspiration, and this channel will never trade one for the other. Azotobacter is powerful, documented, and real, but it is not magic, and pretending otherwise would make us no different from the industry we are pushing back against. In soils with pH below 6.0, heavy clay compaction, or near total depletion of organic matter from years of synthetic-only inputs, azotobacter will struggle to establish a viable population. The organism is an amplifier of biological activity, not a resurrection tool for chemically sterilized earth. If your soil smells like nothing, no earthiness, no life, just dust, you will need to build a foundation of organic matter first. Even something as simple as a thin layer of compost worked into the top 6 inches before your culture will take hold effectively. But here is the critical reframe. Even that limitation is an argument against the industrial system, not for it. The reason so many modern gardens have degraded, biologically depleted soil in the first place is precisely because decades of synthetic fertilizer use have collapsed the microbial ecosystems that once made soils self-sustaining. The cure for the problem the industry created is not more of the industry's product. It is rebuilding what was there before they arrived. And azotobacter, once your soil is ready to receive it, is one of the most powerful tools for doing exactly that. A 2021 meta-analysis published in the journal Frontiers in Plant Science, reviewing 64 independent field studies across 18 countries, found that biofertilizer programs incorporating azotobacter allowed farmers to reduce synthetic nitrogen inputs by an average of 52% while maintaining or improving yields. 52%. That is not a marginal adjustment. That is cutting your fertilizer bill in half in the most conservative reading of the data. Using an organism you can grow in a jar on your counter for the cost of a cup of coffee. You already know the science. You already know the history. You already know who benefits from you not knowing any of this. Now it is time to actually build the thing. And I promise you, this next part is simpler than anything the fertilizer industry ever wanted you to believe was possible. This is the part they never wanted you to reach. Not the history, not the science. This, the moment where the knowledge leaves the page and enters your hands. Because information about a suppressed technology is interesting. A jar of living, nitrogen-fixing bacteria sitting on your kitchen counter, ready to transform your soil, grown by you, owned by you, costing you $2. That is a different category of threat entirely. So let us build it. The first thing you need to understand is what azotobacter actually requires to thrive. Because this is not a delicate laboratory procedure. This organism has survived in open soil for 1.5 billion years. It is robust, adaptable, and genuinely forgiving. The main reasons cultures fail at home are not complexity, but neglect of a few non-negotiable conditions. Carbon source, correct pH, adequate moisture, and oxygen availability. Get those four elements right, and the bacteria do everything else themselves. Your materials list is almost insultingly simple. You need one clean glass jar of at least 1 liter capacity. A mason jar works perfectly. You need approximately 2 tablespoons of blackstrap molasses, which you can find at any grocery store for under $4 a bottle that will last you dozens of batches. You need 1 liter of clean, non-chlorinated water. If your tap water is chlorinated, and most municipal water is, simply fill your jar the night before and leave it uncovered on the counter for 12 to 24 hours, which allows the chlorine to off-gas naturally. Chlorine is lethal to azotobacter, and this single step prevents the majority of failed home cultures. You need a small amount of your starter material, and here is where most guides either overcomplicate things or lead you in the wrong direction. You do not need to order a commercial azotobacter inoculant to begin, though they exist and cost between $8 and $15 online if you want a guaranteed high concentration starting point. If your garden has not been heavily treated with synthetic chemicals for the past 2 to 3 years and has reasonable organic matter, azotobacter almost certainly already lives in your soil at low population densities. Approximately 50 grams, roughly 3 heaped tablespoons, of healthy, biologically active soil from your garden, taken from 4 to 6 inches below the surface, where microbial activity is highest, contains enough native azotobacter to seed your culture. The enrichment process you are about to follow will selectively amplify those populations dramatically over 5 to 7 days. Begin by dissolving your 2 tablespoons of blackstrap molasses completely into your liter of dechlorinated water. Blackstrap molasses is your carbon source. It contains sucrose, glucose, and fructose that azotobacter metabolizes rapidly, along with trace minerals including iron, magnesium, and potassium that support enzyme production. The concentration matters. Too little carbon and the bacteria starve before establishing. Too much and you risk promoting competing organisms. 2 tablespoons per liter, approximately a 3% solution, is the concentration validated in smallholder biofertilizer production protocols published by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in their 2012 Manual on Low-Cost Biofertilizer Production, a document that exists in their public archive, and that almost no home gardener has ever been pointed toward. Add your soil starter to the molasses solution and stir thoroughly. Now cover the jar loosely, not sealed, never sealed, because Azotobacter is strictly aerobic and needs continuous oxygen exchange, with a piece of breathable cloth secured with a rubber band. A square of old cotton t-shirt works perfectly. Place the jar somewhere warm, between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius ideally, which in most homes means a spot near your water heater, on top of your refrigerator, or on a sunny windowsill during warm months. Once or twice daily, remove the cloth and stir the culture vigorously for 30 to 60 seconds. This oxygenation step is not optional. It directly supports the high respiration rate that Azotobacter depends on to protect its nitrogenase enzyme from oxygen damage, as we discussed in the science section. Skipping daily stirring is the second most common reason home cultures fail. Within 48 to 72 hours, depending on your ambient temperature and the health of your starter soil, you will begin to see the surface of your culture develop a thin, slightly wrinkled film, a biological pellicle formed by Azotobacter colonies concentrating at the oxygen-rich surface of the liquid. This pellicle is your visual confirmation that the culture is working. It may appear cream-colored, slightly tan, or in some strains faintly yellowish. It is not mold. Mold will appear fuzzy, elevated, and often colored green, blue, or black. If you see actual mold, your jar was not clean enough or your water was still chlorinated, and you should start fresh. A healthy Azotobacter pellicle is smooth, flat, and sits directly on the liquid surface like a thin skin. By day 5 to 7, your culture is ready for application. Do not wait longer than 10 days without either feeding it with another half tablespoon of molasses or applying it, because without fresh carbon, the population will begin to decline. To apply, dilute your 1 liter of culture with 5 liters of dechlorinated water, a 1.5 ratio, and water it directly into your soil around the root zone of your plants in the early morning or evening, never in direct midday sun, as UV radiation damages the bacteria. For seeds, soak them in undiluted culture for 30 minutes before planting, a technique that the ICAR seed inoculation trials of 1968 found increased germination rates by an average of 18% compared to untreated seeds. Apply your diluted culture to established plants every 3 to 4 weeks during the growing season. Each liter of starter culture, diluted correctly, treats approximately 25 to 30 square meters of garden bed. Your entire kitchen garden, potentially, from a single $2 jar. To maintain your culture indefinitely, never use the entire jar. Always reserve at least 200 milliliters as your next generation starter, top it back up with fresh molasses solution, and the culture perpetuates itself on a rolling basis. Soviet collective farm records from the 1950s, declassified and translated by agricultural historians at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, document Azotobacter cultures being maintained continuously in village-level production for periods exceeding 15 years, using exactly this serial dilution method. 15 years of nitrogen fertilization from a single original culture. The math of what that represents in saved fertilizer costs, at even the most conservative estimate of $150 per year, is staggering. And every single year of that, the $200 billion industry received nothing. Your culture is alive. Your soil is about to change. And the most important thing you can do right now, more important than any single application of Azotobacter, is make sure the person gardening next to you, the neighbor, the family member, the friend in the community garden, plot 3 rows over, knows that this option exists. Because the only way suppressed knowledge stays suppressed is if the people who find it keep it to themselves. Here is what I need you to understand before this video ends. You did not just watch a gardening tutorial. You did not just learn a cheap fertilizer hack. What you actually did in the last 20-something minutes is something that a $201 billion industry has spent 7 decades and hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying, curriculum influence, and marketing architecture trying to prevent. You learned that you were never as dependent as they needed you to believe, and that knowledge, once it lands, cannot be taken back. Think about what you now hold. A technique validated by Soviet state agriculture in the 1940s, confirmed by Indian national research institutions, across millions of farm plots in the 1960s, supported by a 2021 meta-analysis of 64 independent studies across 18 countries, capable of supplying 20 to 40% of your garden's nitrogen requirement from nothing but air. And reproducible at home by you starting today for $2. The Haber-Bosch process that the fertilizer industry built its empire on requires 400 degrees of heat, 200 atmospheres of pressure, and 1 to 2% of the entire planet's annual energy consumption to do what Azotobacter does, quietly, continuously, and freely in a jar on your counter. That contrast is not a curiosity. That contrast is an indictment. But here is what matters most right now, in this moment, at the end of this video. Knowledge that stays inside one screen, watched by one person, and then scrolled past, that knowledge changes nothing. The reason the industry has been so successful at keeping biological agriculture at the margins is not because their science is better, it is because their distribution is better. They have retail shelves in every hardware store, advertisements in every gardening magazine, sponsored content on every major platform. What we have is each other. That is not a weakness. It is actually the only distribution network that has ever successfully moved suppressed knowledge back into the hands of ordinary people. So if this video showed you something real, if the history landed, if the science made sense, if you are already mentally calculating how much you have spent on fertilizer over the last 5 years and feeling something between anger and liberation, then the most powerful thing you can do right now is not subscribe to this channel. It is share this video with one person who grows food, one neighbor, one family member, one person in your community garden. Because every person who learns to cultivate their own nitrogen source is one fewer customer the $201 billion industry can count on. And when enough people make that choice, the math of their empire starts to change. If you do choose to subscribe, understand what that action actually means in this context. It is not support for a YouTube channel. It is a vote for the proposition that agricultural knowledge belongs to the people who grow food, not to the corporations that profit from their ignorance. Every subscriber to channels like this one is a data point that says the suppressed information economy has a constituency, that there is an audience for truth that was never supposed to reach them. Your Azotobacter culture will be ready in 5 to 7 days. In 3 to 4 weeks after your first application, you will begin to see what 80 years of buried science actually looks like in living soil. Deeper green in your leaves, stronger root systems when you transplant, a texture in your earth that starts to feel alive in a way it may never have before. Document it, photograph it, share it, because your garden is now a piece of evidence. And in the next video, we go even deeper, into a weed that grows in every crack of every sidewalk in the world, that 19th century farmers once called their most valuable soil amendment, that was systematically rebranded as a nuisance by the same industry playbook we uncovered today, and that you have almost certainly pulled out of your garden and thrown away. What you threw away was worth more than anything you ever bought to replace it. That story is coming next.